Welcome everybody to our July research seminar. We're a smaller number at the moment, but I'm assuming a few more will join in. Just before I hand over to Liz, who's going to do the first presentation, I'll just share with you a screen regarding our upcoming what was scheduled to be our October uh, research seminar will now be a combined APTO, Association of Practical Theology in Oceania, and symposium with the annual general meeting. So we're having eight presenters doing we're doing eight short sort of 10-minute presentations with discussion and some hubs in the capital cities. So I don't know whether you want to do something in Otago, Lynn, just having an opportunity to physically get together and meet people who perhaps we've only been connecting with over Zoom in various locations. And yeah, so there's a call for papers there. So if you're interested, so just what you're currently working on, you're not going to be able to get much feedback because of the shortness of the time frame, but with the opportunity to present and let others know what you're doing and perhaps build some networking. So that's the purpose of that. So let me pray and then I'll hand over to Liz. Father God, Creator, we thank you for this opportunity to reflect together about research and your exploring the depths of your knowledge as humble human creatures created in your image. We commit Liz and Lynn as they present this afternoon, Lord, and we pray that what they share with us will be helpful for them, but also helpful for us in learning more about what's going on in the world and what you're doing. So we commit our time to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, Liz, over to you. Feel free to share screen.
Thank you. That's working for you, I hope. Hang on. And I just want to minimize that. Okay, so welcome. And I'd like to commence acknowledging the Bidjigal people and their elders past and present on the land on which I live and work. So this presentation reflects my engagement with the challenge of conducting qualitative research involving sensitive issues that may evoke strong emotions. I do so through a trauma-sensitive lens. I intend to mitigate risks to participants while not restricting their agency or avoiding concerns considered too hot to handle. In particular, I consider how we can approach the ethical value of justice by addressing not only the fairness component of it, but also human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and epistemic justice. My doctoral research is a contemplative participatory theological inquiry to guide a trauma-sensitive ecclesial practice of hospitality, a case study. My research question is, what does feminist trauma-sensitive ecclesiology offer congregations to inform and guide their ecclesial practice of hospitality? The purpose is to articulate a community's trauma-sensitive understanding of hospitality to inform its ecclesial practice in a post-Royal Commission era. And in doing so, I will develop and evaluate an innovative, contemplative, participative theological inquiry process. More specifically, the aims of my research are to describe the hospitality and its perceived limits currently offered by the study community, to probe the underlying beliefs, including theological beliefs, assumptions, and evidence informing practice, and in the light of trauma-sensitive theology, allow alternative theological beliefs to guide an ecclesial practice of hospitality, thus to disrupt theology and practice that is incongruent with trauma-informed practice and draw upon or reimagine theology that is trauma sensitive. I'm embarking on this issue because it's more than 6 years since the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, and our faith community is struggling with the various impasses resulting from the competing needs of those who have lived or living experience of trauma and the community's desire to welcome all. While necessarily focusing on preventing future harm to children and young people, we have found that the Church's policies and procedures adopted in the light of the Royal Commission are unsatisfactory when attending to the needs of those who have been harmed. The theology informing these policies fails to attend to 50 years of interdisciplinary trauma research, more than 2 years of the feminist trauma-sensitive theological scholarship, and anecdotal evidence of some alternative approaches. I'm undertaking a contemplative, participatory theological inquiry, congruent with trauma studies and reflecting who I am. I'm taking a contemplative approach. It is necessarily a participative inquiry, drawing on the expertise of those with lived living experience, embodying the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, bringing an awareness that beliefs, including theological beliefs, shape practice. The research gives significant attention to articulating beliefs informing current practice, and how attention to trauma-sensitive theology could inform ecclesial practice. The proposed empirical work will follow a contemplative dialogue process developed by Nancy Sylvester and her work with the Institute of Communal Contemplation and Dialogue. From this qualitative research perspective, this is a sequence of focus groups, with each round guided by a focus question. So the potential focus questions to guide my work are: what is the study community's experience of hospitality? What are the perceived explicit and implicit limits of hospitality in this community? What beliefs, including theological beliefs, are informing these limits? Through a trauma-sensitive lens, what's not been attended to? What is not being seen? What voices are not being heard? And how would attending to people's lived experience influence the offering of hospitality in this community? Finally, what beliefs, including theological ones, could inform trauma-informed practice of hospitality? In practical terms, contemplative dialogue takes place in rounds, interspersed with ritual and other expressive activities. Each round proceeds as follows. The participants sit in a comfortably spaced circle around a creative focus piece. Introductions and sharing of how people have arrived, noticing what they may need to be left aside, followed by a grounding practice. An opening round to cultivate trust and connection through the sharing of personal, but not necessarily private stories. Importantly, all of these early rounds encourage participation. A focus question is then posed, followed by a period of silence. Participants respond in turn before anyone speaks a second time. Practicing contemplative listening and contemplative speaking, and amid periods of silence, participants build on the contributions of others. Gradually, participants articulate what they are hearing, we are saying. Then communally, we articulating what we are hearing and what we are saying before concluding naturally. Participants reflect on their experience of the session, noticing what is emerging, and appreciation is expressed. This trauma-aware process of contemplative dialogue will be the principal means of generating the empirical data. The communal we will be analysed following Vaughan and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis. The empirical phase involves 3 Saturdays and 6 evening Zoom sessions. Between days 1 and 2, there is a series of 6 evening Zooms exploring faith, trauma-sensitive theology, which will be open to the congregation. The University of Divinity uses the Christian Research Association's Human Ethics Committee, as mandated by the National Health and Medical Research Council and guided by the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. HREC reviews all the research projects involving human participants. This includes proposals involving surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations, or access to personal data. The university provides an online application form that closely follows the NH and MRC guidelines and offers some template documents. All documents are then submitted about 3 weeks prior to the HREC meeting and forwarded to panel members. As an applicant, I met with the panel and approval was given to proceed at the end of May, and I am now recruiting participants. And so I am yet to engage in the actual empirical work. From the start, I knew there would be a plethora of ethical issues involved in the work. It took 16 months to prepare the research proposal for confirmation panel, describe and justify my methodological approach and research design, and prepare the detailed HREC application. Before addressing the particular challenging ethical issues, I want to start with the ethos I bring to this work, an ethos that helps cultivate a culture of trust and respect to permeate the work. My personal ethic can be summed up in 3 scriptural quotes. All are made in the image and likeness of God. The great commandment, love of God with heart, strength, soul, and mind, and love of neighbour as yourself. And I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. The values underpinning the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Research, which are respect for human beings, research integrity and merit, justice and beneficence, and then the elements of trauma-sensitive theological lens. And this is the lens that I've developed out of some previous work I've been doing. So 2 images, and the trauma-sensitive lens consists of trust, truth, justice, relationality or love, and hope or flourishing. The 2 images that I have found helpful as I reflect on the ethical issues of research are waterholes and fences. My ethos is represented by the waterholes, while the fences are the prevention and mitigation strategies identified to circumvent and minimize potential harm. Keeping the image of the waterholes in mind helps to reduce the reliance on fences, which are still necessary. Respect and care for direct and indirect participants is paramount. This includes myself and others involved in the study, as well as the wider community, those who have been harmed and those who have caused harm. The research also needs to be both fair and to witness to epistemic justice. It's imperative that the research actively involves and incorporates the expertise of those with lived experience of the issues involved, and to ensure that their voices inform the research outcomes. While many of the ethical issues related to qualitative research apply to this project, some have been key. And let me just highlight 3 clusters of ethical challenges. The first is me as the researcher. Researcher's self-care, attending to my own self-care is paramount. Thus, I need to ensure that I have various practices, social networks, and professional support in place. There's the potential for role confusion. I'm a researcher and facilitator of these contemplative dialogue circles and the Zoom sessions. I'm also a spiritual director and pastoral supervisor, although I'm not in these roles during the research. To aid role of clarification, the educative component of this work takes place on Zoom, while the data collection occurs in person. Hospitality volunteers, rather than I, will respond to any unlikely event of distressed participants. Then there's the potential for coercion. I have established relationships with the potential participants. Consequently, those interested contact my supervisor initially to express their interest in participating. In retrospect, it has become apparent that attending to this potential risk may have diminished the pool of potential participants, possibly compromising epistemic justice. From experience, we know that notices and announcements are not the most effective way of inviting people to consider getting involved in any form of congregational life. A personal invitation via a tap on the shoulder often encourages a person to consider if they want to participate. I'm curious as to that have already been silenced in the past as a consequence of trauma. Inherent blindness. Another concern for the insider researcher is inherent blindness, which can compromise researcher integrity, while acknowledging the benefits of the insider perspective. Awareness of this potential blindness, interrogation of assumptions, and the practice of critical reflexivity are required. So the second cluster are related to the focus group method or the contemplative dialogue circles. So ethical research takes anonymity and confidentiality seriously. As a group process, offering anonymity is not possible. However, the we data of interest emerges from the combined contributions of the participants and is not attributed to any individual. Likewise, confidentiality cannot be guaranteed. Within the circles, participants are encouraged to only share what they're comfortable with, with others knowing. Participants will be encouraged to be respectful of the contributions of others and to follow the mantra, what is said in the room stays in the room. Such respect for confidentiality will help cultivate trust and safety and develop cohesion for courageous conversations. The study community has an inherent, well-developed culture of honouring confidentiality. It's recognised that withdrawing consent is potentially more difficult when one is part of a group, particularly when the participants have an ongoing shared life together. Yet ethical research requires free giving and freedom to withdraw consent, emphasising this in the exploratory conversations and reiteration of this principle at all stages attempts to enhance the participant's agency. Although unlikely, there is the potential for vicarious trauma as a consequence of stories shared. A trauma-sensitive lens through which this research is conceived, along with a commitment to being a trauma-aware practitioner, mitigates such a risk. While the participants with their lived experience bring their expertise to the study, private stories are not being probed. However, a community-specific, person-centered distress protocol has been developed to guide the appropriate management of distress. Then the third cluster is related to sensitive issues and in some sense is the most challenging within this ethics approval process, given that we are exploring sensitive issues. The research, drawing on the expertise of those with lived experience, sensitive issues such as trauma, loss, grief, sexuality, and gender will be encountered through the contemplative dialogue and Zoom sessions, and they may evoke strong emotions. Therefore, particular attention has been given to recruiting and selecting volunteers, both from a perspective of inclusion and exclusion, including exploratory conversations in which I discuss with the potential participants the consequences of this in relation to their own circumstances. The research is not probing participants' experience of trauma, grief, and loss. However, such personal issues are likely to arise, and it is the living experience of the participants that is the resource and will inform this research. Such research carries risks, including re-traumatization, though the recall of painful events and concerns of stigmatisation if their stories are known. However, when carried out with caution and forethought, these risks can be mitigated. There's also an issue of justice involved here, because engaging in challenging conversations may elicit a range of emotions, some of which are uncomfortable or unsettling. Such issues tend to be avoided for fear of upsetting or triggering people. Hence, these issues are less likely to be researched. It is therefore imperative that rather than avoiding the psychological discomfort, the emotional responses need to be normalised. The emotions in and of themselves are neutral. They are an inherent part of human relationships and interdependent interactions. Participants are encouraged to avoid judging emotions as either good or bad, rather approach them with curiosity and as a resource benefiting both the participants and the research process. In line with current neuroscience, ritual elements and embodied grounding practices are incorporated into the sessions to aid co-regulation. Attention is given to the cultivation of a safe enough and courageous space, both physically and energetically. The need for self-care will be explicitly addressed in the Saturday sessions and the evening Zoom sessions, witnessing to the valuing of well-being for all. And participant-centred distress protocols specific to the community has been prepared. Amid the challenges, there are some invitations for us to consider as we discern the ethical implications of our research. I argue that ethical research needs to be congruent with both our espoused and our operant ethos. I also contend that bringing a trauma-sensitive lens to this work makes it possible to mitigate risks without compromising the agency and voice of the participants who are contributing their lived experience. This requires that we engage with, rather than fear, strong emotions that may be evoked. In this way, the ethical value of justice is upheld, not only in terms of fairness, but also in terms of human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and epistemic justice. As I conclude, I offer a few acknowledgements. Firstly, I'm indebted to Associate Professor Lorna Hallahan and her breadth and depth of experience with ethics committees and qualitative research. She offered expert supervision to guide me through the HREC process, and we're proud of the work that we've done together. There is also a distinct advantage of having a preliminary conversation with the Executive Officer of the HREC Committee, which alerted me to some of the issues that HREC is particularly concerned about in research of this type, and consequently think creatively to mitigate risks and giving voice and agency to the participants. Finally, I am indebted to the HREC panel participants who had to wade through an approximately 25,000 words comprising my application. Their attention to the detail and their encouragement was greatly appreciated. They also offered advice in terms of what I need to be particularly attentive to as I step into the empirical phase of this research.
Thanks so much, Liz. That's very good. It's great just to zoom in on that portion of your overall research proposal and research project, and focus particularly on the ethics, because it's of course a crucial part of what we do, but sometimes just a small part. But it's very good to be able to think deeply about that. So thank you for that. Lynn and John, have you any questions or comments for Liz?
Yeah, what a fascinating sounding project. And yeah, what excellent attention you've given to making sure that you're creating a safe space for the participants. That came through both in terms of creating a safe process, but also within the focus groups themselves, the way that you're given attention to making that a safe and positive context for the people involved. I like the distinction between personal and private sharing, which is just a very clear and helpful framing of that difference. And I liked too the way that you talked about having a period of silence after the question, because it's so easy for the extroverts to dive in and say their stuff, and which kind of distracts other people from their own thinking and processing. So that's again, it's a really hospitable act to create that space for people to just have that pause and be. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about, got other questions too, but my first question is I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're meaning by hospitality in the question. What sort of things are you talking about when you talk about the hospitality practices of the community?
So where this has sort of emerged from is we, like many congregations, say we welcome all. And how does that play out? And can we welcome all? And how do we welcome, if we can welcome all, which is a question in itself, how do we welcome all if you've got people who carry harm and particularly, embodied trauma, and people who may or may not be known to the community who have caused harm? How do we hold both of those, and what needs to be in place to hold both of those? But while I've got what has motivated the research, there's a couple of reasons why. One, I'm wanting the community to define what it means by hospitality. If it says we welcome all, what does that mean for them? And then, well, why is it that? And to then go into the theological beliefs. And I don't want to preempt what they suggest, but I've got my own thoughts, shall I say, around, good Christians welcome all, that the Bible encourages to include, that Jesus lived, welcoming sinners and tax collectors and, didn't exclude people. And also, particularly when we're talking about people who may have caused harm, well, there's the whole theological underpinnings of forgiveness, and what does that mean in our community? So I think there's a whole range of ways that it may go, and the empirical work may only touch on some of these. I don't know where they will take it, but I'm leaving it fairly unstructured to see where they go with it. Within the confines of this space, I've alluded to the fact that it does come out of the Royal Commission, and the safe church practices that churches have put in place. And I don't think that they attend to what hospitality could be for those who have lived experience of harm.
Well, thank you. Can I just ask a follow-up question before we go to John, because I see he's unmuted, lively and ready. It sounds like you're doing your own congregation. Is that correct? Yeah. So are you in leadership in the congregation, or what's your role?
I have served on church council, and I have, until the time of ethics, I've had 4 years or more as safe church person, safe church contact. But in order to do this work, I've stepped away from that. So I don't have any official leadership role. I think, along with many in the community, I would be seen to be a leader in the community. I'm relatively new to the community. For 59 years, I identified as Catholic. I'm Catholic in my DNA, but I'm more than my DNA, and this is not a Catholic community.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting work. I look forward to seeing what you discover out of it.
Yeah, thank you.
We can come back to you, Lynn, as well. I've got more questions, but John, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting when people are talking and there's space for a contribution and sharing their experiences. And so I sort of just maybe make a couple of sort of points. So there's a lot of information, a lot of stuff there, right? So, but sort of in getting participants, I'm just asking, you're not mixing those who have been harmed and those who are perpetrators together in this, are you? Is that,
No. One of the
Okay, yeah, right.
criteria that I put forward to ethics is people who are known to have caused harm would be excluded.
Okay. So it's only those who have received some harm and that.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And I'm not specifically targeting them, but given that it is a congregation with a very high LGBTIQ membership, it would be hard to imagine that the majority of the participants, given the also the prevalence of abuse and trauma in the community, it would be hard to imagine that the majority of the participants wouldn't have either personal experience or know people with experience. And part of the exploratory interviews that I have with people is actually to suss out what would be helpful for me to know as they engage in this. And part of that is there are some people in the congregation that it would actually be a disservice to them to involve them in this because of their own the ease with which they themselves could be what I call activated or more commonly called triggered.
Right. Okay. So you're going to, you know who to exclude, basically. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, one person came up to me after it was announced and said to me, I'm assuming I wouldn't be a good person for doing this. And there was a lot of self-awareness in being able to, for that person to say, this isn't going to be for me at this point of time.
Right. Yeah. So in getting participants, when I did my research, so it was hard to get, particularly I was really worried about being able to get participants, right? So, yeah, I did. So it worked out well. And I think one of the, it's sort of like things involved is that there's in some sense that it's going to bring sort of healing to them in being able to share. So they're actually getting a benefit from it. It's not, so it doesn't come across like you are, sort of getting information for somebody else, sort of purely, but they have some benefit from that as part of that, so one is the healing from the trauma. And the other thing you just mentioned about justice, I'm just wondering how that would work out, because that is, I don't know if that it would be possible in what you are doing, because, justice, when you talk about justice, I'm thinking of the legal system and, punitive measures. So I don't know how that would work out. Sort of, do you envisage that would result in people being charged, or because you're not actually looking at specific instances necessarily?
So justice is one of the values that is forefronted in the ethics process. And the way that it tends to be considered is this research fair? Is the research itself fair?
Okay.
But I'm trying to broaden that understanding of justice to also, and obviously justice in terms of human dignity and how we treat people. But I'm trying to broaden it in terms of also considering epistemic justice, and how do we make sure that we hear the voices that a lot of our research doesn't encourage us to hear. And particularly in terms of sensitive issues, it can be easy to say, well, we won't do this research because it might trigger people. And I'm saying we need to do this research, and how can we do it so that we won't cause harm to people?
Mhm.
So it's epistemic justice from that perspective. However, you also raise an interesting question in terms of, you know, we're not going down the legal system, and that's not. However, if people were to raise their own stories and wonder, you know, is there something I can do? Well, obviously they can, outside the research, begin to look at what they may or may not want to do, and that's for them too. But there's also the justice issue around, well, it's more a repentance and repair type issue around people who've caused harm. And I think this is one of the failures of safe church processes, which focus on protecting children and young people, vulnerable people, from further harm, and they don't include the vulnerable people, those with lived experience of trauma, but rather, you know, people that may be at risk of further harm. But if, and I'm just thinking hypothetically here, if there was someone who was coming into a community who had caused harm, do they just slip in? Or is there actually some repentance and repair work that needs to be done? And so that's justice, I see, biblical justice. And this is where I pick up on Letty Russell's concept of just hospitality. And what is a just hospitality? And part of that is around, through the lens that I'm looking, what do those who've been experienced trauma and harm, what would theologically inform people coming, and I'm thinking here people who may have been part of the community and are returning to the community. What's the work that needs to happen? There's an interesting example. You may be familiar with John Bell from Iona Community, does a lot of the music that's come out of Iona. And he last year wrote a book called The Long and the Short of It, which was a collection of his 5-minute BBC segments and a longer hour-long type presentations. And one of them, I haven't quite got the name right, but it looks at the sin that cannot be mentioned. And in it, he talks of a Methodist congregation in Texas, in which there was somebody in the congregation got picked up in a police sting in relation to child pornography. And the legal system in the US said that he could only return to the congregation if the congregation invited him. So there was a conversation initially between church leaders and the pastor, etc., and they had and parents of children, and then they had a wider congregational meeting. And they decided in the end that they would invite him back, but it was known to the congregation what had gone on, that he was on a covenant and other stuff in place. And some people left the congregation, and I've got some questions around that, but a few people left, but it was seen as a pivotal moment for the congregation because people who had lived experience began to tell their stories, and the congregation actually employed a counsellor to work with people with lived experience of sexual abuse. My question is, him coming in has meant others have left, and where's the justice there? But yeah, I think it is an instructive story. And so therefore, what's the role of restorative practices when we come to look at this? And that's a whole other area that I'm interested in exploring. Yeah.
Right. It's good.
I've probably got about 5 PhDs in this work.
John or Lynn, any other comments or questions before we take a short break?
There's just a couple of thoughts. I don't know if you've come across the Difference course, which is an initiative that's come out of the Anglican Church of England, which it's kind of adjacent to what you're doing, but I think you'd be interested in it even if it's not kind of fully relevant. So it works with how do we live with difference of opinion in various contexts, and so names these practices as being helpful for living with difference. So rather than trying to make everybody think the same and agree, it actually makes space for within complex affairs for there to be difference, and how do we live with that? So just probably tangential, don't get too stuck there, but I thought you'd be interested in it personally. And there's also someone who is just starting their PhD, but I wonder what has happened around it that makes this a research topic. In criminology, I think, sociology, criminology at Birmingham University. I can find her name if you want to email me. And she's looking at the experiences of churches that when somebody who has been convicted of a crime becomes part of their church. And so what is the process by which people accept and welcome, how is hospitality offered to them, what are the parameters that are set around that? So that might also be interesting and might open up some of the more criminological stuff as well. Which just might be tangential, but might be interesting. So if you want to email me, I can find the contact details for her.
And part of the context of where I'm coming from, I was a prison chaplain for 4 years. And so, that whole dynamic, as well as my own lived experience in this space. So, yes, it was interesting because I could have started with the focus on people who've caused harm, but I've specifically gone to those that have been harmed because they're the ones that are not being considered by our policies and what have you, our focus. And, I look at the time and energy that congregations are putting into that aspect of it. And regardless of the fact that it's not addressing these people, it's also taking them away from a whole range of other aspects of ministry that they could otherwise be engaged in. And I feel that we're doing it the wrong way around, but yeah. But I also have to let the research show what's going to happen, what the outcomes are. Yeah.
All righty, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll toss over to Lynn.
Thank you. Thanks for your contributions.
Is that all good? Yep, excellent. Very good. So it's great to just be able to talk a little bit about what I've been doing with this fellowship that I've been part of at the University of Birmingham and Science Engaged Theology. So what I want to introduce myself first, I'm Lynn Taylor from the University of Otago. I've been teaching at Otago since 2018. I finished my PhD in 2017, which had been in relation to contemporary faith formation. Why do previously unchurched people become Christians today was my research question. And so stepped into a teaching role at the University of Otago pretty much straight away, which was great, but meant that some aspects of my finishing, when you finish the PhD and you want to be able to do all the writing stuff, some of that got a little bit more compressed. And so I kind of set it aside for a number of years while I worked on other things, and then I've come back to it now to just kind of revisit these questions around contemporary faith formation and how we can be, how Christians can be best involved in processes of faith formation, and what's kind of happening behind people's stories, what's not only the process by which people adopt faith, but also what's kind of happening at that deeper level, what's motivating that faith formation. So I had some little questions that I had still after my PhD, which I'm able to explore now in a bit more detail, which is great. So today, just want to go through these 4 questions around, first of all, what is science-engaged theology? Because we hear a lot about it at the moment in theological land, this science-engaged theology idea. And so I just want to introduce it and unpack a tiny bit about what it is and how it relates to practical theology. And then to talk about the Birmingham Cross-Training Fellowship that I'm part of, which is kind of good to do because it's an interesting process to be part of, and to demystify a little bit what happens in these fellowships, and really to encourage people to also apply to be involved in such things, because they are really, really helpful and insightful. And then thirdly, just a tiny little bit about what I'm exploring, and I'm really only going to just touch on that very briefly, and then talk about some things that I'm learning, not in relation to my project, but in relation to we might call science-engaged theology generally, and how we might do that. So I'm kind of going to zoom around my own topic a little bit rather than actually homing in on it particularly. So first up, what is science-engaged theology? And from the book by John Perry and Joanna Leidenhag, they say science-engaged theology aims to serve as a reminder to theologians that the local tools and products of the sciences ought to be sources for theological reasoning. Put another way, that leads to better theology if we remember to ask, what methods or tools could help me improve this claim I'm making about the empirical world? And often these will be tools or methods from the sciences. Now, we read that quote and we need to recognise that John Perry is a senior lecturer in theological ethics at St Andrews University in Scotland, and Joanna Leidenhag is also a theologian, associate professor in theology and philosophy at the University of Leeds. So they're both more on the systematic theology side of things rather than practical theology. So science-engaged theology sees science as a source of theological reflection, and it sees scientific methodologies as sound methodologies that are potentially useful in helping to answer theological questions. And so there's this impulse there towards interdisciplinarity, a recognition that other people, other disciplines, other approaches to research, other approaches to knowledge can help to shed light on theological questions. And for people who are working within systematic theology, that's kind of a bit more revolutionary than it is for people who sit within practical theology, because that's very much the world that we live in. And I think that science-engaged theology does look rather like practical theology in many ways. So this approach, it's not new to practical theology. It's very much what we've been doing for decades in our approach to research. So practical theology is theological. It draws on theological resources to understand and interpret, and it recognises that there are multiple sources of theology, that we don't just do theology by going and reading books written about theology, but we're actually open to these other sources. I like the simplicity of the so-called Wesleyan quadrilateral that recognises scripture, tradition, reason and experience as all being sources of theology. And for me, as I work with this particular model, I see reason as incorporating within it the wisdom and insights from non-theological sources, such as psychology, sociology and anthropology, among others, including as they help us to understand and interpret experience. So these disciplines provide insights in relation to personal and social processes. They shed essential light on theological questions. So science-engaged theology invites us to use the tools and methods and insights from other disciplines to help in understanding and answering our questions about the world, and to help us to improve the claims that we're making about the empirical world. So science-engaged theology does look pretty much like practical theology in many ways. It's not something that is new to us as practical theologians. But it's great to see these sorts of ideas and values coming in across the theological disciplines, because I think that there's a lot that science-engaged theology could be attentive to within biblical studies and within systematic theology. So not just diving into the worlds of the text and theological reflection, but also allowing learnings from these other disciplines which tell us stuff about humans that is helpful in us understanding Scripture and understanding the implications of Scripture for the world, or that are helpful for us in asking more, what might be viewed as more systematic theology type questions. So that's science-engaged theology. And then secondly, just to talk a little bit about the science, about the cross-training theologians in psychology fellowship of Birmingham University. This is a project that's been funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And Carissa Sharp, who's pictured in the middle of that photo, sitting down in the beautiful flowery dress, she is the PI on the project. And it's a project that she's pulled together with people, with psychologists from around the world, social psychologists primarily from around the world, and with some theologians, predominantly from the United Kingdom. And she applied for this funding to fund this fellowship program. So all up, the fellowship runs over between 2023 and 2025, and it runs in two 16-month cohorts, which both have different topics. The fellowships are designed to help theologians engage more deeply with psychological research, and they are attentive to both psychological research methods and also psychological theory. So they're trying to help expand the research methodologies that theologians might adopt, and also the content or the ideas that we might explore or that might help to shed light on theological questions. So the fellowships are designed to offer support for theologians to participate in psychological cross-training, equipping us with skills to draw upon insights from psychology, and providing us with funding, we like that, to undertake psychologically informed theological research. So there's been two 16-month projects, cohorts, and these two topics. The first one, how humans conceive of and think about divine realities, and the second one, the role of religion in human flourishing and social relationships. I'm part of the first cohort, and the second cohort has just started meeting in Birmingham for their first residential this week. So the program is made up of some fun. We play games together, and that's fun. And it's made up of two residentials in July and August of one year, and then in April of the following year, which trains us in social psychology theory and methods. There's also 12 monthly online seminars that just provide a whole lot of resourcing, again, around theory and methodological approaches. We can apply for a up to £20,000 worth of small grant. It seems like a pretty big grant to me, but it's called a small grant. And we're assigned a psychology mentor as well to work with us. So somebody who is a psychologist who works with our particular, in the area that relates to our particular project. And then we all come together for a final gathering in August of next year, where it's kind of a show and tell, talking about the research that we've done. So one of the lovely things about it is that the application process for the small grants mirrors the application process for other grants. So we're filling in actual, real life grown up forms about our research, but we're doing that in a really supportive environment as well, getting some feedback from those who are administering the grant to say, you need to just strengthen this bit a little bit, or you need to talk a bit more about this, or have you thought about that? And so it's this very supportive environment where we're not kind of let loose to to just go and fill in the form and you don't really know what you're doing, but you're actually, you've got a mentor to help, and you've also got the Carissa, the PI on the project, is just very supportive at helping everyone to get through with that stage of the process. The mirroring of the application form being the same just again opens us up to that process that's normal, and yeah, gives us a dry run or a more friendly sort of run at an application. So it's just been a great process in terms of all of the things that I've learned, but also just that supportive environment and getting to know a bit about how these big grants work and how one might actually go about applying for one. And yeah, so that's been really helpful as well, just kind of demystifying that process. In our first residential, we had someone from the John Templeton Foundation come to the residential and spend some time with us. So there was opportunity for meeting with them and talking about some of the priorities and our interests and stuff like that. So that's just been helpful as well. Another thing that's been really helpful is just been, I mean, in my PhD, I read a lot of psychology, among other stuff from other disciplines, and I tend to think, I don't know, that psychologists know a whole lot of stuff, and they do, but they know that they don't know all the things as well. They're just like us, really. They know what their limits are and what their strengths are and what their limits are. And so that was just really helpful too, to recognise, to get to know some really top-notch psychologists, and to begin to see them as peers rather than as, I don't know, people who know stuff that I can never know, sort of thing. So that was really good too, really helpful in that process as well. So that's the fellowship. So fully funded in terms of all the residential programs, the EFAs are covered, everything's covered in terms of our costs. And there was a small honorarium in terms of the time that we were away from home for those residentials. And then, as I said, the £20,000 of funding, which for me enabled me to have some some buyout time, or I've got parts of my role are a little bit precarious, and so I'm permanent 0.5, and then I have this 0.3, which isn't permanent, and so that was coming to an end. So I was able to use some of my funding to keep me at 0.3 in the first semester of this year, and then also to have a research assistant for a day a week for the whole year. So that just opens up the possibility to be working with somebody else on a project as well. So I've got my psychology mentor who's advising, get together with once a month, and also my research assistant who's a former PhD student of mine. We get together, we talk through things. I'm increasing her capacity, as well as she's doing a whole lot of work behind the scenes as well, which is just fabulous. So that's a bit about the cross-training there. In terms of the project itself that I'm looking at, one of the things that came out of my PhD was this apparent connection between what people valued about God and their own personal aspirations towards living well and being better people. And so I'm exploring this very tiny little piece of my PhD results in more detail, and looking at whether it does in fact act as a motivation, as a motivator for faith formation today. So the people that I interviewed told me that they appreciated several things about God. 5 things came through in the data. Attributes of God that they valued were God's love, power, patience, acceptance, and forgiveness. And interestingly, they also wanted themselves to be more loving, more patient, more accepting, and more forgiving. So there was this very interesting relationship between those 2 pieces of data that I didn't really get to explore in any detail at all. And so I'm grateful for the chance to look at it in a bit more detail today. So if we consider it theologically, we can think about how the Imago Dei might acts as an ideal that regulates personal and social conduct, according to McFadden, and a vocation to which people are called. And so they're really helpful theological ideas that we can draw on to offer some explanation around what's happening for people. But I wanted to drill down and see whether it was actually happening and actually do some quantitative data analysis around how people's God representations, their God concepts and their God images correlate with their personal aspirations towards relational authenticity or towards being a better person. So there's a lot of technical terms in there. Psychologists often distinguish between God concepts, which are more theological beliefs or understandings about God, more kind of head knowledge stuff, from God images, which are the more relational and emotional heart knowledge type things. And then some scholars use the term God representations to capture both of those aspects. So that's what I'm doing, is kind of looking at both the concepts and the images, both the head and the heart stuff. And then their personal aspirations from psychology, again, we can draw on ideal self theory to investigate what people perceive to be their ideal selves, and how that relates to what they perceive to be their actual self and what they perceive to be their ought self, which is more extrinsically motivated. So I'm interested in people's ideal self and how closely that is aligned to what they know, what they understand to be about, what they understand God to be like. And then the other technical term in there is the term relational authenticity, which is one that I coined out of my PhD, because all of the various parts of my PhD came together in this concept of relational authenticity, that people were finding faith today because they were desiring relational authenticity, which I define as the project of becoming the person you are, imaging the relational God. And so they were motivated by a desire for this. They witnessed this relational authenticity being expressed in the lives of Christians that they knew, and God was enabling relational authenticity to be experienced by people as well. So that kind of the technical terms that I've jammed into my research questionnaire. And I have a questionnaire live at the moment. I am purposively sampling people who were recently baptised in Baptist churches in New Zealand, baptised in the last 5 years, and asking them a series of questions that seek to find out what it is about God that they valued as they decided to be baptised, what their aspirations were, and we can do some work to see to what extent they are mapping onto each other. So designed a questionnaire with both quantitative and qualitative data that will be generated from it. So I can do some lovely quantitative analyses, but also have some lovely rich data as well, because I could only do quantitative stuff. So I've done that as a purposive sampling with, as I say, people are baptised since 2019 in Baptist churches in New Zealand. And then I'm using the same tool as part of a wider questionnaire that I'm doing on faith formation more generally, that anybody can complete with some other questions in there as well. So that's what I'm using my £20,000 for. And the data's coming in. It's so nerve-wracking, that whole recruitment thing, Liz, isn't it? That you just hope that there's going to be some people. And I didn't realise that I'd had some more advertising go live the other day, and I went and logged into Qualtrics yesterday, and it's like, oh, there's some people that have filled in my second questionnaire, and I didn't really know that I'd started advertising it. So that was exciting. People are responding, which is great. So that's my project. That's what I'm doing with the £20,000. And then finally, I just want to talk briefly about these 5 strategies that I've recognised, or that we've recognised, for working at the intersection of different fields. And this came out of one of the monthly workshops that we do, online seminars that we do. And I was meeting with it was just a small group, just two of my other fellows and Carissa Sharp, who's our PI. And we started just talking around about how do we actually do this thing when we're working at this interface between different fields. And we realized that there are these 5 different approaches that we could take. And the first approach is to study more and to go deep. To when we're faced with different ideas from a different discipline like psychology, to actually build our baseline knowledge and going deep in order to understand more fully. And it's certainly essential to read extensively around a topic and to arrive at a deep understanding. But when we're working at this interface between theology and other disciplines, it's really important to recognise that it's not feasible to obtain a full knowledge of every subject that offers insights to our own research area. It's simply not possible, and we can't do it. And so we might become paralysed by the idea that we need to actually be reading extensively enough that we know enough about this topic. And actually, yeah, you certainly need to study deep, you study more and go deep, but you need to also recognise that you're never going to get there in terms of knowing all the stuff. And so the second strand is about defining tighter parameters. And so there's all these areas within psychology that might shed some light on my topic, but I've decided to go down this path of ideal self theory, and particularly to investigate this concept called the Michelangelo phenomenon, which is usually explored in relation to partner relationships, but I think has some really fruitful potential for exploring what's happening in relation to people's perceptions of God. So focusing in on a smaller area of investigation allows you to become a little bit more knowledgeable about that smaller area. We still won't be able to know all the things about that smaller area, but it does enable us to focus our attention strategically. And that is necessary and helpful. And then in terms of knowing how do you decide what to even focus on, that's where leaning into assistance and support from others is really helpful. So talking to people in other disciplines about what they know about it. For us, we've got our mentoring psychologists who can help us, and we've got the others on the project as well who can help with that. But for anyone in any context, there are people who will be available just to offer support and assistance in relation to areas that we aren't so knowledgeable about. So we're all invited to learn from others and to check in about our ideas. And in some ways, when we're doing a study, we have supervisors who fulfill that role for us. And when you graduate, you kind of lose that supervisory relationship, and we need to forge new relationships that offer that support. And there's certainly value in having a diversity of people and voices that can speak into our projects and we can learn from. And then the fourth thing is to recognise that we're not going to become psychologists. We're not going to become experts in these adjacent areas. And so we're invited to be honest about the limitations, both our own limitations and the limitations of our study. And so I talked about narrowing in on a particular field and a particular setting those tight parameters. We need to be upfront about that when we write about our research as well, that we are only looking at this particular slice, and maybe somebody else will come and look at another slice or another slice, and together we build up a picture. So we're not kind of imagining that we can promise that we're investigating everything from all angles, but it's about bringing our piece of the puzzle. And then the final thing is just to learn from the process of research, to recognise that we're always learning, and that struggle is part of the journey, and that working at the intersection of different fields isn't easy, but to lean into these sorts of strategies that I've talked about here to provide the scaffold or framework to support our research work. And so for me, I think they are helpful things to remember as as I go ahead in my research, and I think for everyone who's working at those intersections between different fields, which is what we as practical theologians do. So there we go. 4 questions, very briefly answered. Science engaged theology, the cross-training fellowship, tiny little bit about my research, and then questions around how we might experience, how we might live at this intersection and not become either paralyzed or or drown in data and information.
Great, thanks, Lynn. That was really, really helpful. So thank you for that. Lee, Liz, or John, have you got any questions or comments?
Thanks, Lynn. I found it encouraging, particularly as someone that I trained as a scientist. That was my undergraduate training, and have moved into the theological space. In my work, bringing together lots of fields that take me beyond my own fields of knowledge. And I think for me, one of the gifts of being actually, my primary supervisor is actually a professor of social work. And so, getting that interdisciplinary and have you thought about looking at it from this way or that way, things that I wouldn't have come across had I done a purely remained within the theological network. You mentioned that there's this cross-training, and I'm hearing the cross-training as to how psychologists are informing the theologians. How are the theologians informing psychologists?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read psychology and I read sociology of religion, there can sometimes be some really obvious things that have just been missed, right? There's just like, but what about, it's, and yeah, so I'm curious about that as well in terms of whether there's space within those Templeton grants for the things to flow the other way. What I've found with the psychologists who are part of this cross-training fellowship is that they are very keen to learn from theologians. And so we've had a couple of times when some of them have reached out and said, this is what I'm investigating. What do you think? And the example that I gave Liz, of the person who's looking doing criminology, that was an instance where they said, this is what we're thinking of doing, and what do you think? And I was able to say, actually, there seems to be this gap that you haven't thought about. And they're like, you're absolutely right, there is a gap we haven't thought about. So so there is that keenness on a kind of interpersonal or one psychologist seeking feedback sort of area. But I think there's a whole lot of scope for more of that to be happening, perhaps in more formal ways as well, and for building those collaborations which are reciprocal, going both ways, would be fruitful for everyone, I think. So I don't know how that happens on more than just an informal sort of way, but it is a really interesting question. One of the things that the fellowship, one of the goals of the fellowship is to increase the ability, or to increase theologians using psychology. And so I decided to do, because one of the outputs we need to do is a conference presentation, and I decided to do mine to ecclesiology and ethnography in the UK, to a bunch of theologians, because then that's helping them to see how they can use psychology in their work. But there is, I think, also value in choosing. I could have gone the other way to a psychology conference, which would have opened up the space of how might theology inform psychology as well, which isn't kind of the goal. But I think there's definitely room for it to be a goal for somebody, because I think it's really important.
And part of my motivation of exploring this is somebody I did my spiritual direction training with, actually a number of them, but one in particular, is a psychologist, and he doesn't actually he offers some spiritual direction, but he's actually asking these same sorts of questions, exploring these same sort of questions with his psychology clients around, the flourishing and the whether or not they use theological language in there, and some of them do. So I think there is a lot to the gifts of both disciplines can enrich the other. I've got some other questions, but let's go to John if he's got any first. And you're on mute.
You're still muted.
Yeah. I think it will be very valuable. I'm talking from a, practicing pastor, sort of practicing in theology, sort of outworking with people. There is a lot of psychology involved with that, and so where this balance of understanding the psychological side and so with the Spirit's guidance in counselling and looking after people will be quite interesting to explore, right? So, but it's sort of a bit of a new area, sort of that. I think I need to. Yeah, I'm probably talking more personally on to be more, sort of put on to sort of explore and learn about it a bit more actually on this area. So I think it's very great that there's cross discussion and an openness, like Liz said, sort of like is a two-way conversation. Then I think it's much more productive from that. So so and I think it seems to be heading in that, sort of moving in that direction. So it sounds like a great opportunity.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, and I think, John, too, there's a helpful, within psychology, there's kind of the therapeutic sort of dimension of psychology, which is operating, and then there's a whole lot of other psychological stuff that's going on that just relates to how persons are, and it's more, it's more the hard science sort of psychology rather than the how it applies in the therapeutic context or whatever. So so that's a helpful thing to bear in mind as well. I think that kind of distinction that in both of those areas is certainly the former has more obvious direct relevance to pastoral ministry immediately, but that latter stuff too is also really interesting in terms of helping us to unpack and tease out what's happening for people in their everyday lives as well, and what's motivating them for what they're choosing to do and how as well.
Yeah, I like the discover, is it, on authenticity as attracting people into the church. Yeah. So I think this is very, very important. Yeah. And probably a little bit of difference. I don't know, right? So between theology and psychology. Psychology could be as a more sort of like analyzing it, say, academically from a distance, sort of looking at it in a test tube, say. But in theology, not necessarily always, right? So it can be looked at it sort of in a test tube, but it also is very, sort of really essentially engaged, I think, right? Sort of in personal involvement and personal, sort of, life. Yeah. So that I can understand how that authenticity becomes that attraction, so that maybe psychology doesn't necessarily have. But just a thought.
Yeah, and psychology is often going to look at a little tiny slice as well. And so there'll be an experiment or something that looks at this particular slice, and then somebody else will look at another slice, which is kind of what I'm doing with this next project, is looking at this little slice. But that practical theology does have that more integrative work that happens around it as well. And we do have a lot invested in our topics. We care deeply about the areas that we're exploring. Not to say that psychologists don't, but that it is somehow different to be operating within the community of faith, exploring how the church can be the church in the world. It's kind of, how can we help people flourish as these deeper motivations behind what we do, rather than just seeking to understand, which can be sometimes the motivation for some scholarship.
Right.
Liz, you had another question or comment?
I noticed and this has been one of the changes, moving from a scientific background into a theological, and particularly as a PhD candidate in theology. It's a very solitary way of working, and yet, nearly all scientific papers are multiple authors, and you've got big teams, and I do think that theology has a lot to learn from that sort of approach, and how can we be more collaborative and draw on the perspectives from a wider diversity, as well as, the skill sets, etc. So that was encouraging. Well, that was something that went through my mind. And then the other comment I had, when you were talking about tight boundaries, and that you have to narrow down on what you're going to focus on. This is more from a humorous perspective, but my father was a professor, and we used to joke about the role of higher education was to learn more and more about less and less until you knew absolutely everything about nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yes, that we can't do everything. And again, I think theology has something to offer that, in terms of many gifts, we're all part of the one body, and bring our own gifts to that. But theological research, as I've experienced it, doesn't tend to be as collaborative. And that's one of the good things about this sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a real lack in theological research. I think I'd love to see some more collaborative work done across different subdisciplines of theology, across different countries, just people who are interested in the same stuff too, coming together and talking about it, and actually making that more tangible somehow by actually doing projects together. I think a lot of the funders really like that sort of stuff as well. So there's a pragmatic reason to do it, as well as just to bring more than one brain into an area of exploration, I think is great. But that does require an ability to actually kind of look up from all that's busily happening around us, and to pre-plan in advance, and to pull together a group and to investigate. And there's skills there that need to be learned and developed. There are sometimes it can be very time consuming. So, but I think practical theology would be enhanced by more of that, and maybe there's space for for there to be some sort of apto project that gets worked on over a period of time. Or maybe it's not an apto project. Maybe it's a couple of people putting their hands up and saying, "I'm interested in this. Who else is interested in this? Can we just build something together?" I think could be fruitful, and I'll probably be in, because I'm keen on that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I certainly warm to all that. I was on a research committee once, which was looking at a PhD application, which was we use the language of integrative. So integrating is cross-disciplinary. So it was at the ACT, so it was primarily a theological process, but was obviously going to have a lot of sociology and psychology as part of it. And one of the academics said, opposed it, because he said, in order to be able to do that, sociology and psychology, you have to have qualifications in that area. And it really highlighted to me that the sort of the zenith of siloing, which saying you've got a particular area you specialize in, and you've got to stick to that silo, and you can't sort of venture into something cross-disciplinary. But we won the argument. There was enough of us there who sort of said, no, you don't have to be an expert on everything in psychology. And as you said, Lynn, to be able to zone in on one particular area, and as long as you've got enough enough, understand the language enough, you can really become an expert in that particular little slice of psychology if you put the effort in. And the other factor is the democratization of knowledge. So once upon a time, you had to have a qualification in psychology in order to understand psychology. Now, particularly in the psychology realm, there's so much free research available. As long as you can learn the basic generic terms, you can explore that particular slice at great depth. So that's one thing bad. But then I think the idea of partnerships, cross-disciplinary partnerships, is especially attractive for me to do research with a psychologist or a social scientist. I think even is probably even better because then we do have the expertise in both the silos, but we're able to really cross over really, really effectively. So that's some really stimulating things. Thanks, Lynn. Any other closing comments or questions before we wrap up?
Again, I'm thinking in the field that I am, the fact that there's been 50 years of trauma scholarship and it hasn't really affected ministry on the ground. So yes, we've now got the 20 years of trauma theological scholarship, but that's still not hitting the ground. So yes, I think the more that we can have this interdisciplinary approach and do PhDs by teams.
That's a very radical.
Yeah. And I mean, also to honour some of the Indigenous ways of knowing that, do we need to rethink how our academic approaches, are they helpful in this day and age? But I'm not going to be able to change the institutional settings that much.
Yeah. Liz, we've got Karen McClintock coming to do a block course at the University of Otago in the first February, I think, of next year. So a week on pastoral care, trauma-informed pastoral care, or trauma-informed ministry, which will be great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to you all. It's those who haven't joined us have missed out, haven't they? So.
They have.
They'll
be flocking to watch the recording, I'm sure.
Yeah, a very rich conversation. Thank you all, and bless you all, and I'll see you around the traps.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Bye.